teacher go to school?
And here's your...
What do you think of what's going on right now, mate?
These evil little invisible parasites.
Satan-worshipping Freemason moron.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
We're not run by factions.
Get the fuck out of camera!
There are much more powerful international forces in play.
Is this pink guy? Is this what pink guy is? I don't fucking know what's happening.
Please go outside and look at the moon quickly.
It's been crazy, guys, but guess what? It's how it is, mate.
Mate, because I want to do you slowly.
Well, I ain't spending any time on it.
Well, g'day, patrons, and thank you for joining us for our premium episode. It is the 13th of April. Joel is cracking a subsidised tin, I think it is.
Oh, this one's actually one that I got from Aldi recently because it was $8 a six-pack, and I can't say no to cheap beer. But they did hit me up. They sent me a message saying, do you want more beer? And I'm like, fuck, I guess so.
I do need more beer. It's funny you should mention that.
Sent me 2 cases of like quite strong. Some of them are quite strong. So yeah, I'm getting there.
They know you very well at Aldi.
Well, at CBco, our delicious, lovely sponsors. Aldi, I don't know. I think they've got bigger problems than me.
Yes, so that's our sponsor. In fact, CBco, but they need to get you more tins. I think that's the answer, isn't it?
Well, they're trying to. They have reached out and saying, hey, hold on. Do you need more tins? I'd hate to make you ask. Please get in touch. It's amazing. I love them. They're so good.
That is good. That is very, very good. And look, we just want to say to our patrons, and there are quite a few of you now, we just want to thank you for your ongoing support. We look forward to providing you with this sort of premium episode stuff. And we've got a fair bit to discuss today. Some of it very, very political, and some of it just cooked nonsense.
Yep. We'd like to have a midpoint.
Yeah, to kick us off, really, we wanted to start with The Voice. And so, as we all know now, the Federal Liberal Party under Peter Dutton has announced it will actively campaign for the no vote.
Cunts.
We don't know the question yet, right?
Yes, that's...
that still has to go through the Parliament. And then we sort of know the form of words, but what will go through the Parliament will actually be the question. But Peter Dutton is saying no, regardless of what it is, no.
Don't like it.
Yeah. He and the majority of his party, this is the thing. So the Conservatives are in the ascendancy on what's left of the Liberal Party room. A lot of the moderates got the flick at the last election. That's just the way it goes. So the majority of his party think Indigenous Australians deserve to be recognised in the Constitution, but he and they are opposed to The Voice, an elected advocacy group advising the Parliament and the Executive. Yeah. And that's his stance. And when we think of political motives, what would his motives be for this? And I'll get on to question how this is such a high-risk thing. But what would his motives be? And the only thing that comes across to me is that he's basically trying to rally around the Conservative base.
Which is basically what they've done for the last, 10 odd years.
I know.
Turnbull wasn't that. Turnbull was the wet. But look what
happened.
His
party was, yeah.
The fucking, he's in a situation where we had this sort of, soft conservative, somewhat progressive guy, and they fucking hated him.
Yeah, they hated him, and he had to basically do their bidding.
Yeah.
So all the stuff that he wanted to do didn't get done.
Yeah.
Because they would have rolled him.
Well, I mean, what happened, right?
Well, in the end, it went that way. Exactly right. So yeah, they've been saying, look, we need to be conservative, and you go, well, you really have been.
Yeah.
And look where you are now.
Yes, this is a bad policy. It's going badly for you. Stop.
Yeah,
stop. He's already dead.
Definition of insanity: doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. Yeah. So this is dumb. This is a really dumb and high-risk strategy, and I'll explain why. We'll explain why shortly. But let's start with a few facts, and these are kind of important things. This is the longest duration in Australian history since our last referendum. Our last one was in 1999. That was regarding the Republic, which was belted 45 to 55, winning no states, and only in the ACT did it get majority support.
That's not good.
There was also the question of a constitutional preamble in 1999, a sort of less important question, and that was also beaten decisively. So by the time we vote on this referendum, perhaps in October, November, maybe December, I'd say October, it will have been 24 years since our last referendum. And that matters because the mythology around referenda in this country tend not to, we always sort of get very pessimistic about them.
Mm-hmm.
And the history of it can be quite persuasive. But the question is, has the country changed in the last 24 years? Well, the Liberal Party may not think it has, but the rest of us know that it has. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like the last thing that we sort of know of being that feels like a referendum, it wasn't, was the plebiscite, same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that was a referendum because they're not across the brief. And you see that a lot in caucus spaces.
It was actually a postal poll. It wasn't even a plebiscite.
Yeah, because it was postal, of course, yeah.
It was, in fact, a postal poll, but it was so significant and so overwhelming that no one could avoid the outcomes that needed to be legislated. It should have been legislated in the first instance.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, we can bag Malcolm Turnbull for that, but it's also a fact that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard both voted against same-sex marriage in the Parliament.
Yeah, they're fucking beholden to Catholic unions. It's like,
Certainly Julia was, yeah. And Kevin, well, Kevin's a
Catholic himself.
Mad Catholic turned Anglican. No, the other way around, Anglican turned Catholic.
Oh, okay. I don't know the difference between
High Church Anglican. Yeah, High Church Anglican. And grew up as a Catholic.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
But the longest period before, it was 16 years, and that was Menzies in 1951, Joel.
Okay, yeah. So he had the one to outlaw the Communist Party. So that was going to be an amendment to the Constitution, which is fucking hilarious. That was defeated, and that was despite huge support from the media. I mean, that wasn't one of those things where it was, knocked down because it was like in the Republican one, which was like, this structure sucks, this question sucks, blah, blah, blah. But it is pretty funny. Oh, Communist parties are there. I'm going to put it in the Constitution.
Damn those communists. And of course he tried to do it by legislation. And knowing that it wouldn't get through the High Court, it required a constitutional amendment. So he went to the people, and in one of his rare losses, the people overwhelmingly hit it out of the park.
Yeah.
So the communists were free to move among us.
Oh, terrible. Meredith Bergman should have been jailed. Well, I guess she was.
She was. She was a few times.
Yeah, that's fair. So, yeah, it was 16 years later. Country went to the ballot box again for 2 more questions. And the first was to increase the number of members of the House of Representatives, which was decisively beaten. And I'm not sure why that was on the cards or what.
Well, it's like saying, do you trust your politician? So it's really a dumbass question. It's like saying, would you like to have more politicians? And it was like, no,
not really.
No, not really.
It's
no,
fine.
No, thank you.
We're doing fine. And then, of course, there was the one which was the power to give was to give the federal government the power to make laws for Indigenous Australians in states as well as the territories, and whether to include all Indigenous Australians in population counts, which wasn't happening before. They just weren't people.
They weren't counted.
Yeah, not the census, which is kind of fucked up. That one got 91% voting yes, and of course carried in all 6 states, as you can imagine.
91%. It tells you a fair bit about the Australian psyche, and that while these were very, very modest reforms, constitutional reforms, it tells you that there's a significant amount of empathy, shall we say, for Indigenous Australians. And so, that was carried 91% yes.
Yes, that is quite strong. And, I mean, look, when it comes down to it, these sort of racially motivated, definitely things that are rooted in the First Nation thing, but also just progressive things. We forget that the majority of the country support these sort of things because that loud minority tend to drown out this obvious consensus of fairly progressive thinking with this irritating, well-funded, well-coordinated, some fuckhead like Marcus Blackmore's and the other guy who's putting money toward the no vote. They get their voice out there, and it feels like there's more people against it than there are. So
the polling would indicate fairly soft support for the thing. So anyway, but in what happened in 1967 was sections 51 and 127 of the Australian Constitution. Well, section 51, paragraph 26.
Section 51 was
wiped
huge.
Out, which the power of the Commonwealth to legislate for the people of any race other than the Aboriginal people of any state was removed from the Constitution, as was the section of 120, as was section 127, which said the counting of Aboriginal natives. That's what it called it in the Constitution, right? Aboriginal natives as part of determining state and Commonwealth populations. Of course, this was written in 1901, or in fact drafted 10 years before that.
A famously progressive time in this country's history.
Yeah. And look, I can get into constitutional history, how some progressives were involved in its writing, and they were all kind of dismissed ultimately, and then the actual change of the Constitution was made very difficult. We'll talk about the double majority in a minute. So they were gone. And there's also a bit of a myth going around the Constitution makes no mention of first Australians. Well, it clearly did for 66 years, right? Just calling them, not first Australians, calling them Aboriginal natives, by the way.
Yeah.
And further, the argument for the yes vote goes that the Australian Constitution does not protect first Australians, or indeed anyone else, against discrimination. That's the way the Constitution stands at the moment. And the Racial Discrimination Act, which protects people by ethnicity, including first Australians, that was introduced by the Whitlam government, is a law by Parliament or statute, and it has been compromised 3 times since it was enacted in 1975. The most recent was when John Howard called the troops in on the Northern Territory intervention. So that would be if you had something like The Voice or some anti-discrimination element in the Constitution, that would have made the NT intervention illegal.
Yeah.
But because it was only a legislative act, they could simply just legislate over the top of it, and then to organise the NT intervention. Let's talk about that, because no one wants to talk about that at the moment.
Well, no, they're all about improving fucking outcomes. We don't hear anything about Dutton on this whole intervention thing, which is the last time they tried to improve outcomes in their government. And let's face it, if it did work, if one of their biggest policies for sort of like, Indigenous welfare worked, we'd be hearing about it right now.
Well, we'd see it. We'd see it in measurements.
They'd be bragging about it.
We'd see it in measurements like extended life expectancy amongst first Australians. We'd see it in educational opportunities rising. We'd see, but none of those measures has got anywhere near it. So the intervention ultimately failed. It was based. I don't know if you remember it, Joel. I mean, certainly at a political level, it was designed as a sort of policy to try and wedge Kevin Rudd, who was hugely popular and waiting to and hunting down John Howard. So they brought this thing in, and Kevin Rudd just went, yeah, I agree with it, and that was the end of that. So it was based on these awful anecdotal stories of hideous crimes being committed in remote Indigenous communities.
Get deja vu, mate.
Yeah, a little bit of that. Sex crimes, high rates of STDs among Indigenous populations in remote Australia. Now, look, certainly what we would say is that poverty that occurs in those places is unacceptable to Australians. It would be unacceptable in any other environment. But as for some of the crimes that were committed, so-called crimes, rape of 10-year-old girls and all this sort of stuff, much of it was unsubstantiated and would never be substantiated.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is proposed here, and will be left basically the federal parliament to sort it out, to draft and pass legislation, is The Voice itself. But it's generally speaking a group of Indigenous Australians elected or appointed to The Voice. We'll see what happens when it's figured all out. To provide advice to the Parliament and, of course, like most controversially, to the executive, which is essentially speaking the cabinet.
Yes.
Which is controversial because it's in cabinet where the legislation affecting Indigenous Australians, they'll end up developing from that sort of thought bubble state into a black letter law proposition. And a lot of cabinet has a surprising amount of protections and things on the way that they speak. You can't get FOIs on some of the stuff. Cabinet is a very different beast to the rest of Parliament, and there is a level of power concentration there that people don't quite see. But having access to that is legit. it means that they're not a bunch of, sort of First Nations backbenchers sitting there screaming into the chamber. They have got access to a very powerful room. But the thing here is, so there's this argument that's saying that once the legislation's drafted, then it's too late for the voice to sort of do much to address Indigenous disadvantage.
When things get into the Parliament, when legislation is drafted and gets into the Parliament, it's too late by that stage. You need to be advising the executive. And this is where some of the constitutional stuff has the constitutional, this will be subject to endless litigation and high court appearances and so forth. By the way, Brett Walker, who is our most eminent jurist, most number of appearances before the High Court, says it won't. Now, he is not the Pope. He is not.
Yes.
He is not. He is capable of making mistakes. But when Brett Walker says something like that, I tend to listen.
But also, who's challenging it? Who's fucking taking it to the High Court? The Liberals? Fucking various right-wing fucking cooker interests? I mean, realistically, when it comes down to it, it's like that sort of thing of saying, like, if you do this, I will kill this bunny rabbit. And that bunny rabbit's blood will be on your hands. And it's like...
What they're saying is that the voice will have similar power to the Parliament and similar power to the executive, and the High Court will have to interpret it that way. That's something. Brett Walker says it won't, right? Brett Walker says it won't, and he is our most eminent jurist. Not a perfect man, right?
No, he's a gun for hire.
But our most eminent jurist says it won't. And a lot of other people support that proposition as well. Look, politically, it's a huge roll of the dice for Dutton and the Libs, not least of all because it could split the party. And let's just run through those in the Liberal Party who don't agree with Dutton and the no proposition. The most senior Lib in the country, Tas Premier Jeremy Rockcliffe, will push for a yes vote. Joel?
Yeah, we've got the Western Australian Liberal leader, Libby Medham.
Such as she is, yeah. She's got a very small party room.
Three people in there or whatever.
Two.
So she's two?
Yeah.
I was kidding. Jesus Christ, it's that bad. I thought it was 5 or something.
This is where it could all head for the Federal Liberal Party.
Yeah, fucking cool, couldn't it? So she told the Australian... Personally, I'll be voting yes, as I support recognition of our First Nations people in the Constitution, but I also strongly support all Australians being able to make their own decision.
Well, that's
wishy-washy, but I mean, it's also not.
Yeah.
Like she says she's voting yes. That's as good as saying, it's on. So in Western Australia, the opposition is led by the Nationals. Do you know how many people they've got in there?
A few more, and a few more in the upper house.
Okay.
But it's a belting majority. I think there might be 4. Now, the Nationals are not... Oh, it's overwhelming in Western Australia. The Nationals are not the Nationals of Barnaby Joyce. The West Australian Nationals aren't. They're a completely separate party, and they do not indeed have much.
Oh, they're not a coalition with Liberals.
No, and they are, and they are not the National Party as we know it, which really only exists in Eastern Australia.
Interesting. Okay.
Not Tasmania.
Well, even so, as you say, they are not the party of Barnaby. But their leader Shane Love is saying that he supports a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice. So,
yes.
Even the fucking Nats over there, they're not the Nats, the Nationals by name. So in Mr. Dutton, his home state of Queensland, LNP leader David Christofouli said he had an open mind about the voice and encouraged others to do the same, or at least have the same. That's not helping in a situation where right-wing solidarity is make or break, but I'd be fucking doing the same thing. And Queensland's the place where I think it's got the lowest polling numbers.
Lowest polling numbers. Still a majority, 49 to 43.
Okay. And then there's a don't know in between.
So you need 50 plus 1, so it's not quite there. But there'll be a significant amount of don't knows. This is something the polling doesn't, well, not the polling, but the polling analysis doesn't take into account, that there'll be a significant number of blank ballots. People will vote informal too, although it's very easy to say yes or no. But some of us you know,
There'll
we
be dicks
struggle.
drawn.
We struggle with forms. Some of us struggle with forms. And so there will be a few informals among them.
There'll
too.
be cocks. There'll be definitely some cocks. And
There will be.
that's a part of democracy, and that's fine. So in a joint statement, Victorian Liberal leader John Basuto and Nationals leader Peter Walsh said their parties also had an open mind in the fucking People's Democratic Republic of Socialist Danistan.
Yeah.
And basically, you know, when it comes down to it, this is the Albanese government's proposed constitutional amendment. So opposing it makes sense, but they're not.
A lot of liberals are for this. Northern Territory Country Liberal Party leader Leah Finocchio